June 6, 1944. 0500 hours. Major Werner Pluskat stands at his observation post overlooking Omaha Beach, telephone receiver pressed against his ear, trying to make his superior understand what his eyes are seeing. "There must be 10,000 ships out there," he says, his voice careful, measured, professional. On the other end of the line, his regimental commander's response is immediate and dismissive. "The Americans and British don't have 10,000 ships. Get hold of yourself, Pluskat." But Pluskat isn't hysterical. He's a decorated artillery officer with 3 years of combat experience across 2 fronts. He knows how to estimate naval formations. He's spent months preparing for this exact moment, studying intelligence reports, memorizing Allied ship silhouettes, calculating firing solutions for different invasion scenarios. And what he's witnessing through his artillery scope exceeds every estimate, every war game, every intelligence assessment. Wehrmacht has produced. The horizon is no longer visible. Where sea should meet sky, there is only steel. Ships extending from his left peripheral vision to his right, packed so densely that in some sectors he cannot see water between hulls. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, their guns already beginning to elevate toward the French coast. Behind them, transport ships by the hundreds. And behind those, more ships and more, layered in formations that disappear into the morning mist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Pluskat had fought in Poland, in France during 1940, on the Eastern Front during the First Winter Offensive. He had witnessed the Wehrmacht at the height of its power, had seen what German military efficiency looked like when properly supplied and coordinated. He understood logistics, understood the relationship between naval tonnage, ground combat power. And the fleet assembling offshore represented something beyond his professional experience. This wasn't an amphibious probe. This wasn't a diversionary raid. This was the entire industrial capacity of 2 continents converted into a single operational hammer, aimed directly at the section of coastline he'd been ordered to defend. 3 hours earlier, the night had been quiet. Pluskat had conducted his routine inspection of the coastal batteries under his command, walking the positions in darkness, checking that crews remained alert despite months of false alarms and tedious waiting. The Atlantic Wall fortifications around his sector were impressive by any standard. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions carefully surveyed for maximum coverage of the beach approaches. Obstacles arrayed in the tidal zone, mines buried in the sand beyond. His unit had spent the winter of 1943 improving these defences, working under the assumption that when the invasion came, preparation would matter more than numbers. The assumption had been wrong. Preparation mattered. Numbers mattered more. And the numbers assembling offshore were beyond anything Wehrmacht planners had considered possible. The first indication had come just after 4 in the morning, when naval gunfire observers reported unusual activity to the northwest. Pluskat had walked to the observation bunker, raised his binoculars, and seen nothing but darkness and ocean. Then dawn began to break, and the ocean disappeared beneath steel. He stayed on the telephone with his regimental headquarters, describing what he was seeing with increasing precision. The naval formation appeared to be in 3 distinct layers. Capital ships, the battleships and heavy cruisers positioned furthest from shore, their main batteries capable of reaching targets several miles inland. Medium warships, destroyers and light cruisers, arrayed in a middle zone where they could provide direct fire support for landing craft. And closest to shore, specialized vessels he couldn't immediately identify, their purpose unclear, but their presence ominous. Behind this naval screen, the transport fleet. Pluskat counted ships in one sector and multiplied by the number of sectors visible. His mathematics kept producing impossible numbers. 5,000 ships. 6,000. 7,000. Each recalculation drove the total higher. And these were conservative estimates, counting only vessels he could clearly identify. The formations extended beyond visual range in both directions. There could be more. Probably were more. His regimental commander wanted grid coordinates, wanted Pluscat to identify priority targets for counter-battery fire. But what target could possibly be prioritized when the entire horizon was a target? Pluscat tried to explain this. The fleet wasn't concentrated in a specific landing zone. It was distributed across the entire visible coastline, suggesting simultaneous landings at multiple beaches. The Americans and British weren't attempting to establish a single beachhead they could reinforce. They were attempting to establish 5 or 6 beachheads simultaneously, overwhelming German defensive capacity through sheer geographic dispersion. The tactical implications were immediately clear to Pluscat. His artillery batteries had ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained firing under optimal conditions. The naval fleet offshore could sustain bombardment for days, possibly weeks. His guns were positioned in concrete bunkers, relatively safe from counter-battery fire, but limited in their ability to adjust aim quickly. The naval guns were mounted on mobile platforms that could reposition, concentrate fire, or disperse, as tactical situations required. His men were highly trained, experienced gunners who understood their equipment and their mission. But they were perhaps 200 soldiers tasked with defending several miles of coastline against a fleet that suggested tens of thousands of assault troops were about to land. German intelligence had estimated that any Allied invasion would involve perhaps 1,000 ships, maximum 1,500 if the British and Americans committed everything they had. Those estimates had shaped German defensive planning. Coastal batteries were positioned to engage naval formations of that size. Infantry reserves were calculated to counter landing forces consistent with 1,000 shiplifts. Artillery ammunition stockpiles were based on engagement durations appropriate for repelling an invasion fleet numbering in the hundreds. The fleet Pluscat was observing rendered all of that planning obsolete. If the Allies could assemble 7,000 ships for one operation, they possessed naval capacity Germany had never seriously considered. More importantly, they possessed the industrial capacity to build 7,000 ships, the logistical capacity to supply 7,000 ships, the organizational capacity to coordinate 7,000 ships in a single operation. This wasn't military power. This was industrial power converted directly into combat capability, and the conversion rate suggested that the Allies could sustain losses that would break any conventional military force. Pluscat lowered his binoculars and looked at his watch. 0530 hours. The landing craft would launch soon. Naval bombardment would begin shortly after. His men would fight well. He had no doubt about that. German soldiers were well-trained, well-led, experienced. They would inflict casualties. They would force the Allies to pay for every meter of beach. But they couldn't win. The mathematics were too absolute. 7,000 ships represented a resource disparity that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. He thought about his conversations with other officers over the winter, late-night discussions in the officers' mess about what invasion would look like. They had assumed it would be a conventional amphibious assault, similar to operations they'd studied from the Great War or from Germany's own military history. A naval force would approach. Coastal defences would engage. Landing craft would attempt to reach shore under fire. Infantry would establish a beachhead. Reserves would counterattack. The outcome would be determined by which side could mass forces more effectively at the critical point. That assumption had been based on historical precedent, on the belief that amphibious operations were inherently risky because defenders held natural advantages. Shore-based artillery outranged naval guns. Prepared defensive positions provided protection that landing troops couldn't match. Interior lines allowed defenders to concentrate reserves faster than attackers could reinforce beachheads. These advantages had been real in previous wars, in previous centuries, when both sides operated under similar resource constraints. But the fleet offshore suggested the Allies weren't operating under resource constraints at all. They had built enough ships to overwhelm coastal defences through simple numerical superiority. They had assembled enough landing craft to put entire divisions ashore simultaneously. They had concentrated enough naval firepower to reduce any defensive position that revealed itself through counterfire. The traditional advantages of the defender were being neutralized through industrial abundance. Pluscat returned to the telephone and made his final report to regimental headquarters. His voice was calm, professional, free of emotion. 7,000 ships minimum, he said. Multiple landing zones along the entire sector. Naval bombardment will commence within the hour. Request permission to begin firing when targets are in range. His commander acknowledged the report and told him to hold position until further orders arrived. Pluscat understood what that meant. There were no further orders that would calm a Greinsfeld, change what was about to happen. The invasion was unstoppable, not because German defences were inadequate, but because Allied resources were effectively unlimited. His unit would fight because that was their duty. They would inflict casualties because they were skilled professionals. But the outcome had been determined before the first landing craft touched water. Germany had lost the industrial preparation race during peacetime, and no amount of battlefield excellence could compensate during wartime. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours, exactly as Pluscat had predicted. The first salvo came from the battleships positioned furthest offshore, their massive guns creating thunderclaps that rolled across the water like a physical force. Pluscat watched through his observation scope as shells the size of small automobiles arced through the dawn sky, their trajectories visible as dark streaks against the lightning clouds. They impacted on the bluffs behind the beach, detonating with eruptions of earth and concrete that shook his observation bunker, despite being positioned 3 kilometers from the nearest impact. Within minutes, the entire naval fleet had joined the bombardment. Destroyers engaged targets closer to shore. Cruisers walked their fire inland, systematically destroying anything that might threaten the landing zones. Specialized rocket ships, which Pluscat had been unable to identify earlier, suddenly revealed their purpose by launching thousands of small rockets in rippling waves that saturated entire sections of beach with high explosives. The noise was beyond anything Pluscat had experienced, even on the Eastern Front during the worst artillery duels. This wasn't a barrage. It was industrial demolition conducted by naval artillery, the systematic application of overwhelming firepower to reshape terrain. His own batteries remained silent. He had given strict orders that no gun would reveal its position until landing craft were actually approaching shore. The only advantage his unit retained was concealment, and that advantage would last only as long as they maintained fire discipline. The moment they engaged, Allied naval observers would identify their positions and direct counter-battery fire that would likely destroy them within minutes. So they waited, watching the bombardment, understanding that when their turn came, survival would be measured in minutes rather than hours. Pluscat used the time to observe the invasion's organization with professional detachment. The naval gunfire wasn't random. It followed a systematic pattern that suggested careful planning and precise coordination. First, the battleships engaged hardened defensive positions, the concrete bunkers and fortified artillery emplacements that required heavy shells to destroy. Then the cruisers hit transportation, infrastructure, roads, bridges, railway lines that German reserves would need to reach the coast. Finally, the destroyers worked over the beach defences themselves, the obstacles, the minefields, the trench lines where infantry would attempt to resist the landing. The entire bombardment sequence lasted 40 minutes, during which Pluscat estimated that more shells landed in his sector than his entire artillery battalion could fire in 6 months. The material disparity was staggering. His ammunition supply represented what German industry could produce, transport, and stockpile over many months of effort. The naval bombardment represented what Allied industry could load onto ships and deliver in less than an hour. The ratio suggested that Germany was fighting a different kind of war than the one Wehrmacht doctrine had prepared for, a war where material abundance mattered more than tactical skill. At 0630 hours, the landing craft began their run toward shore. Pluscat watched through his scope as hundreds, then thousands of small vessels emerged from behind the screening warships and formed in organized waves. Each wave consisted of dozens of landing craft, moving in precise formations, their timing coordinated so that successive waves would hit the beach at regular intervals. The organization was impressive, mechanical, relentless. This wasn't an amphibious assault in the traditional sense. It was an industrial process, the systematic transfer of men and equipment from ships to shore using standardized procedures repeated thousands of times. The landing craft themselves were unremarkable machines, flat-bottomed boxes designed to carry 30 soldiers or a single vehicle. But their uniformity suggested something significant about Allied production capacity. Every craft appeared identical, manufactured to the same specifications, operated by the same procedures. Pluscat had read intelligence reports about American mass production techniques, about factories that could build ships the way automobile plants built cars. He had dismissed those reports as exaggerated propaganda. The invasion fleet suggested the reports had been conservative. His artillery batteries opened fire when the first wave reached 800 meters from shore. The carefully concealed guns revealed themselves, their positions marked by muzzle flashes and smoke. Pluscat's experienced crews fired with precision, walking their shells across the water, adjusting for wind and tide, achieving hits on several landing craft in the first minutes of engagement. He watched men spill into the water, saw vehicles sink, observed the tactical effect of well-aimed artillery fire on densely packed landing formations. Then the Allied naval response demonstrated what 7,000 ships could accomplish when properly coordinated. Within 90 seconds of his first guns firing, destroyers offshore began engaging his positions with direct fire. The naval guns were smaller than his own artillery pieces, but they were mounted on stabilized platforms with sophisticated fire control systems. And there were dozens of them concentrating on his handful of batteries. The concrete bunkers that had seemed so formidable during construction began taking direct hits from 5-inch naval shells, the impacts creating shock waves that concussed crews even when the concrete held. Pluscat's phone line to regimental headquarters went dead after the third salvo hit his command bunker. The structure remained intact. The walls were 3 meters of reinforced concrete, but the communications cables running through conduits in the ceiling had been severed by the concussion. He was now isolated, commanding by runner and direct observation, making tactical decisions without any information about what was happening in other sectors. For all he knew, his battery was the only German unit still effectively engaging the invasion. The isolation was probably an advantage. If he had known what was happening across the entire landing zone, the information would have been demoralizing. Through his observation scope, he watched the invasion proceed with mechanical inevitability. Despite his artillery's success in destroying several landing craft, the waves kept coming. For every craft his guns hit, 10 more reached the beach successfully. The Americans were sustaining losses that would have forced a German operation to halt and reassess, but the landing continued without any apparent disruption. They could afford to lose landing craft because they had built thousands of landing craft. They could afford to lose soldiers because they had trained millions of soldiers. The entire operation was designed to absorb losses that would be considered catastrophic by German standards and continue functioning without adjustment. By 0700 hours, American infantry were on the beach in strength. Pluscat could see them through the smoke and dust, small figures moving in organized units, taking cover behind the obstacles his engineers had positioned in the tidal zone, returning fire toward German defensive positions. The beach defenses were fighting back. Machine gun nests that had survived the naval bombardment were engaging targets at close range, inflicting casualties, forcing the Americans to advance slowly and carefully. But slowly was still advancing, and the numerical advantage kept growing as more waves landed. Pluscat counted 12 separate landing waves in the first hour, each wave putting approximately 500 men on the beach. 6,000 soldiers landed in his sector alone, and his sector was perhaps 1/5 of the total invasion frontage. The mathematics suggested 30,000 troops had landed in the first hour across all beaches. By noon, the number would exceed 100,000. By evening, 250,000. And this was just the infantry. The landing craft were also bringing ashore vehicles, artillery pieces, supplies, everything needed to sustain combat operations inland. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The scale of the logistics operation was perhaps more impressive than the combat operation itself. Pluscat watched specialized landing craft deliver trucks directly onto the beach, watched engineering units begin clearing obstacles while under fire, watched supply ships offshore begin transferring cargo to smaller vessels that could reach the shallows. The Americans weren't just landing an army, they were building a supply system capable of sustaining that army indefinitely. Every vehicle that reached shore, every ton of ammunition that made it past the beach, every gallon of fuel that got transferred from ship to land, represented Allied logistical capacity that Germany couldn't match. He thought about German amphibious operations, the landings in Norway during 1940, the river crossings on the Eastern Front. Those operations had been carefully planned, tightly choreographed affairs where every ship and every soldier served a specific purpose, and loss of even a few vessels created immediate complications. The German military operated on the assumption that resources were limited, and therefore had to be used efficiently. Conservation was built into Wehrmacht doctrine. Equipment was maintained carefully, supplies were rationed strictly, operations were calculated to minimize losses because replacement was difficult. The Americans offshore were operating under completely different assumptions. They were willing to accept losses that German commanders would consider reckless because they could replace those losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. A landing craft destroyed meant 30 soldiers lost, but there were hundreds more landing craft and thousands more soldiers. An artillery battery destroyed meant fewer guns supporting the landing, but there were enough guns offshore to compensate through sheer volume of fire. The entire operation was designed around abundance, rather than efficiency, and abundance was proving to be a more effective operational principle than efficiency when the abundant side had sufficient industrial capacity to sustain it. By 0800 hours, Pluscat's battery had been effectively neutralized. Not destroyed, the bunkers still stood. Most of his guns remained operational, but they could no longer engage targets effectively because any position that revealed itself immediately drew concentrated naval fire that forced crews to take cover. His men were huddled in the deepest parts of their bunkers, waiting for the bombardment to shift inland so they could resume firing. But the bombardment wasn't shifting. The destroyers offshore maintained continuous suppression fire, systematically targeting any German position that showed signs of activity. Pluscat made his way through the command bunker to the observation position, moving carefully through corridors filled with concrete dust and the smell of explosive residue. His artillery sergeant was there, a veteran who had fought since Poland, watching the beach through a crack in the damaged observation slit. "They're building a road," the sergeant said, not looking away from his observation. "On the beach. Under fire. They're building a road." Pluscat raised his own binoculars and confirmed what the sergeant was seeing. American engineering units had moved equipment onto the beach, bulldozers and graders, and were literally grading paths through the sand while combat operations continued around them. They weren't waiting for the beach to be secured. They were preparing logistics infrastructure simultaneously with the assault, understanding that every minute saved in moving supplies forward would compound into hours and days of operational advantage. The confidence required to grade roads while under fire suggested the Americans knew the beach defenses couldn't stop them, that German resistance was an obstacle to be worked around rather than a threat to be defeated. The road building confirmed what Pluscat had suspected since first seeing the fleet at dawn. This invasion wasn't designed to barely succeed. It was designed to succeed with overwhelming margin, to advance inland regardless of German resistance, to establish logistics capacity that could sustain operations for months or years if necessary. The Allies had learned from earlier amphibious operations, had studied Dieppe and Anzio, had calculated exactly what resources were needed to guarantee success, and then had assembled 5 times those resources to eliminate uncertainty. By mid-morning, the battle for Omaha Beach had effectively ended, though fighting would continue for hours. American forces had established a beachhead roughly 2 kilometers deep, had cleared most of the immediate defensive positions, and were beginning to move inland in organized formations. Pluscat's battery was isolated, surrounded, functionally irrelevant to the larger battle. His remaining guns could still fire, but the targets were beyond their range now, and any sustained firing would simply invite more naval bombardment. He made the decision to save his remaining ammunition for the American ground forces that would eventually overrun his position, understanding that his unit's contribution to the defense was essentially complete. He used the time to write a report, knowing it would probably never reach higher headquarters, but documenting what he had observed for historical record if nothing else. He described the fleet size, the landing sequence, the naval gunfire coordination, the logistics preparation, everything that made this invasion different from anything in his military experience. He concluded the report with an assessment that would have been considered defeatist if anyone with authority had read it. "The invasion cannot be stopped through tactical means," he wrote. "The Allied material advantage is absolute. German forces can delay but cannot prevent the establishment of a permanent lodgment. Strategic implications are severe." The strategic implications were indeed severe, though Pluscat understood only part of them. The 7,000 ships offshore represented just one operational theatre. Intelligence reports suggested the Allies were simultaneously conducting operations in Italy, planning additional landings in southern France, preparing offensives on multiple fronts. If they could assemble 7,000 ships for Normandy while maintaining operations elsewhere, their total naval capacity exceeded anything German planners had estimated. More troubling was what this suggested about Allied industrial production. Ships required steel, required shipyards, required thousands of workers and months of construction time. 7,000 ships represented years of industrial effort, millions of tons of steel, an industrial base so large that military production was apparently just one output among many. Germany had converted its entire economy to war production in 1942, sacrificing civilian consumption to maximize military output. The results had been impressive by German standards: enough tanks to equip dozens of panzer divisions, enough aircraft to maintain substantial Luftwaffe strength, enough weapons to arm millions of soldiers. But German industrial capacity, even when fully mobilized, produced output that met military requirements with little margin. There was enough, barely enough, never abundance. The Allies had apparently achieved abundance. They had built enough ships to launch multiple simultaneous invasions. They had manufactured enough landing craft to put entire armies ashore in single operations. They had produced enough weapons to equip not just their own forces, but also the Soviet Union, through Lend-Lease. They had accomplished all of this while maintaining civilian economies that, according to intelligence reports, still produced consumer goods and maintained living standards higher than wartime Germany. The industrial disparity suggested that Germany had been fighting an unwinnable war from the beginning, though this realization came too late to change anything. Victory in 1940 and 41 had been possible because Germany had prepared for war while the Allies had not. But once the Allies mobilized their industrial capacity, once American factories began converting peacetime production to military output, the material balance shifted irreversibly. Every month that passed widened the gap. Every Allied factory that converted to war production added capacity that Germany couldn't match. By 1944, the disparity had reached the point where the Allies could launch an operation like Normandy, absorbing whatever losses German defenders inflicted, advancing through sheer accumulated material superiority. Pluscat sealed his written report in a map case and gave it to a runner with instructions to attempt reaching regimental headquarters if possible. The runner saluted and disappeared into the damaged corridors. Pluscat didn't expect the report to arrive, didn't expect anyone to read it if it did arrive. But he had documented what he had witnessed, and documentation was what officers did. The facts existed independent of whether anyone acknowledged them. By afternoon, American ground forces had advanced far enough inland that Pluscat's position was clearly behind their lines. No relief force was coming, no counterattack would restore the situation. His remaining option was to continue fighting until ammunition ran out or position was overrun, fulfilling his duty to delay the advance as long as possible. His men understood this without being told. They had fought long enough to recognize when a situation was tactically hopeless, and they had enough professional pride to continue fighting anyway, because that was what soldiers did. The Americans reached his position near sunset, approximately 14 hours after the invasion began. They came carefully, professionally, using infantry supported by tanks and artillery, not taking chances despite their overwhelming advantage. Pluscat watched their approach through his damaged observation scope, noting their tactics, their equipment, their organization. They were well-trained, well-equipped, confident. They moved like soldiers who knew they had unlimited support behind them, who understood that if they encountered serious resistance, they could simply call for naval gunfire or air support or additional ground forces. They had options that came from abundance, and abundance shaped everything about how they fought. The surrender came without drama. Pluscat ordered his remaining men to destroy their weapons' firing mechanisms, rendering the guns inoperable without complete disassembly and replacement of critical parts. Then he walked out of the bunker with his hands raised, followed by 37 surviving members of his battery. The Americans searched them efficiently, separated officers from enlisted men, and directed them to a temporary holding area that had been established in a crater from the naval bombardment. Pluscat sat on the torn earth and watched American vehicles rolling inland along the road that engineers had been building that morning, a continuous stream of trucks and half-tracks and tanks. all moving with the confident rhythm of an army that knew its supply lines were secure. A young American lieutenant approached him, speaking serviceable German learned from textbooks. "You are the battery commander?" Pluscat nodded. The lieutenant consulted a clipboard. "Your position was designated target reference point 47. You delayed our advance by approximately 90 minutes. Good shooting." The comment was professional, soldier to soldier, acknowledging tactical competence while accepting strategic inevitability. Pluscat appreciated the honesty. 90 minutes. His battery had fought for 14 hours and achieved a 90-minute delay. The ratio captured everything about this invasion, about this war, about the relationship between skill and resources when resources reached a certain threshold. Further up the coast, other German commanders were reaching similar conclusions through their own experiences. Oberst Ernst Goth commanded the 352nd Infantry Division sector at Utah Beach, where the American 4th Infantry Division had come ashore with fewer casualties than expected, because the current had pushed landing craft 2,000 meters south of the planned zone into an area that was less heavily defended. Goth had spent the morning attempting to organize a counterattack with forces that were supposed to be in reserve, but had been partially committed to other sectors during the confusion of the first hours. By noon, Goth understood that his counterattack, even if successfully launched, would accomplish nothing strategic. The Americans had landed 23,000 troops at Utah Beach in the first 6 hours. His entire division numbered approximately 12,000 men, and perhaps half of those were actually available for combat operations after accounting for casualties from the naval bombardment and units tied down defending their positions. He could attack with 6,000 soldiers against 23,000, with no artillery support because his guns had been suppressed by naval fire, with no air support because the Luftwaffe was absent, with no prospect of reinforcement because German reserves were being committed piecemeal across the entire invasion front. The mathematics were absolute. His division could fight, could even achieve local tactical victories, but the operational situation was already lost. The Americans would keep landing troops, keep bringing supplies ashore, keep advancing inland, and his division would keep shrinking through casualties and exhaustion until it ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The only question was how long that process would take and how many casualties it would cost both sides. Goth made the decision to conduct a fighting withdrawal rather than a suicidal counterattack, preserving his division's combat power for as long as possible, while accepting that preservation meant delay rather than victory. At Sword Beach, British forces had pushed inland almost 10 kilometers by evening, supported by specialized armor that German defenders had never encountered. Churchill tanks mounting petard mortars that fired massive charges capable of destroying concrete fortifications. Flail tanks with rotating chains that detonated mines, clearing paths through defensive minefields. Bridging tanks that could span anti-tank ditches in minutes. The British had designed equipment specifically for breaching the Atlantic Wall, had manufactured that equipment in quantity, and had trained specialized units to employ it effectively. The entire system represented years of preparation, massive industrial investment, and careful tactical planning, all focused on solving the specific problem of amphibious assault against fortified defenses. General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division defending the Sword Beach sector, watched the specialized armor work through his defenses with professional despair. His engineers had spent months creating obstacles designed to stop conventional tanks. The British simply drove around them using equipment designed to neutralize obstacles. His concrete bunkers were supposed to withstand anything except direct hits from the largest naval guns. The British deployed specialized bunker-busting weapons that destroyed fortifications from close range. Every defensive advantage he thought he possessed had been neutralized through British engineering innovation, backed by industrial capacity to manufacture specialized equipment in quantity. The reports from all sectors began reaching Wehrmacht headquarters at the Berchtesgaden by late afternoon, transmitted through surviving communication networks that were increasingly degraded by Allied air attacks and ground advances. The staff officers who compiled these reports into coherent assessments struggled to convey the scale of what was happening. The language of military reporting had been developed to describe battles where both sides operated under roughly comparable resource constraints. The Normandy invasion didn't fit that template. The Allies weren't fighting within resource constraints at all. They were applying unlimited resources to achieve their objectives, and unlimited required new vocabulary. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel arrived at his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon late in the evening, having spent the day travelling from Germany where he had been visiting his wife. He had missed the first critical hours of the invasion, had been absent when command decisions needed to be made about committing panzer reserves, had lost the opportunity to influence the battle during its most fluid phase. Now he stood in the operations room, studying the maps that showed American and British penetrations averaging 5 to 8 kilometers inland across a front of approximately 80 kilometers, and he understood that those first critical hours probably hadn't mattered as much as doctrine suggested they should. The maps showed something that military theory said should be impossible. An invasion force had landed on a heavily fortified coast, defended by multiple divisions, and had advanced inland across a broad front without being contained at the beaches or thrown back into the sea. German defensive doctrine was based on the assumption that amphibious assaults were vulnerable during the landing phase, that concentrated counterattacks during the first hours could destroy beachheads before they consolidated. But the Allies had apparently designed their invasion to be resistant to counterattacks, to succeed even if German responses were perfectly executed. Rommel turned to his chief of staff, General-Lieutenant Hans Speidel. The Panzer Reserves, have they been released? Speidel nodded grimly. Earlier this afternoon, on orders from OKW, the 12th SS Panzer Division is moving toward Cayenne. The Panzer Lehr Division is en route from Le Mans. Both divisions are under continuous air attack during movement. Estimated time of arrival has been pushed back repeatedly. Rommel walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere to the north, the invasion fleet was still offshore, still landing troops, still building the logistics infrastructure that would support operations for weeks or months. And his best mobile reserves were creeping forward through French countryside, being harassed by Allied aircraft, losing vehicles to air attack before ever engaging ground forces. How many ships did the reports say? Rommel asked. Speidel consulted his notes. Estimates vary by sector. Major Pluscat at Omaha reported at least 7,000. British intelligence assessments suggested 5,000 to 6,000. The consensus estimate is approximately 6,500 ships of all types. Rommel did the arithmetic in his head. 6,500 ships. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain in 1940, had calculated that it would need approximately 1,500 ships and barges to transport 9 divisions across the English Channel. The Allies had assembled 4 times that many ships for this operation, suggesting they were landing not 9 divisions but closer to 40 divisions, an entire army group committed in a single operation. They are landing their entire strategic reserve, Rommel said, half to himself. Everything they have accumulated in Britain over 2 years, all of it coming ashore simultaneously. Speidel nodded. The Americans alone appear to be landing 5 divisions in the first wave. The British and Canadians, another 3 or 4 divisions. Follow-on forces are already approaching the beaches. Intelligence suggests they plan to land 15 to 20 divisions within the first week. 20 divisions. Rommel commanded approximately 60 divisions across all of France and the Low Countries, but many of those were static infantry divisions, with limited mobility and questionable combat capability. Perhaps 20 divisions were truly mobile, capable of conducting the kind of maneuver warfare that could potentially contain the invasion. And the Allies were landing 20 divisions in 1 week, all of them fresh, fully equipped, supported by unlimited naval gunfire and air superiority. The strategic mathematics were crushing. Even if German forces fought perfectly, even if every counterattack succeeded, even if Allied casualties were 10 times German casualties, the material balance would still favor the Allies because they could replace losses and Germany could not. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions faster than they could be reconstituted. Italy was requiring substantial forces to prevent Allied breakthrough. The Atlantic Wall garrisons were static, unable to be redeployed. Germany's strategic reserve had been depleted through 3 years of warfare across multiple theatres, and there was no industrial capacity to rebuild that reserve while simultaneously maintaining forces in combat. Rommel turned back to the maps and studied the invasion beaches more carefully. The Allied landing zones were separated by sectors that remained under German control. Traditional military wisdom suggested that isolated beachheads could be defeated through concentrated attacks that prevented them from linking up. But the distances between beaches were small, perhaps 10 to 15 kilometers, and the Allies had landed sufficient forces at each beach that linkage was probably inevitable within 24 to 48 hours. More importantly, the naval fleet offshore meant that no German counterattack could succeed even if it reached the beach, because naval gunfire could destroy any concentrated force that revealed itself. "They have achieved what we attempted to do in Poland and France," Rommel said. "They have created a situation where tactical response is irrelevant because operational advantage is overwhelming. We defeated France by creating conditions where French forces could not concentrate effectively. The Allies have done the same to us, but through material superiority rather than maneuver surprise." Spadell nodded slowly. "Then the invasion cannot be defeated." "The invasion was never going to be defeated," Rommel replied. "We hoped we could prevent it from succeeding. That hope was based on assumptions about Allied resource limitations that were incorrect. They have more ships than we have coastal artillery, more aircraft than we have anti-aircraft guns, more supplies than we can interdict. The question is not whether they will establish themselves in France. The question is how long we can delay their advance toward Germany." The psychological impact of this realization spread through German command structure over the following days, as reports accumulated and the full scale of the invasion became clear. Junior officers who had fought at the beaches understood immediately that something unprecedented had occurred. Mid-level commanders who compiled sector reports recognized patterns that suggested systemic Allied advantages rather than local German failures. Senior officers at Army Group and OKW level saw strategic implications that extended far beyond Normandy. By June 8th, Allied forces had linked up most of their landing zones, creating a continuous front approximately 80 kilometers wide and 10 to 15 kilometers deep. They had landed more than 300,000 troops and 30,000 vehicles. They had established supply dumps ashore containing thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and equipment. They had constructed artificial harbours, the Mulberry Harbours, which allowed ships to unload directly onto French soil despite the absence of captured port facilities. The entire operation demonstrated planning, sophistication, and logistical capability that exceeded anything in German military experience. The artificial harbours were perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the invasion for German commanders who understood logistics. Rommel had assumed that Allied forces would need to capture intact port facilities to sustain their invasion, That German strategy could focus on defending ports while accepting that beaches might temporarily be lost. The Mulberry harbours eliminated that assumption. The Allies had literally brought their own ports with them, massive prefabricated structures that could be towed across the Channel and assembled in French waters. The engineering required to design such structures was impressive. The industrial capacity required to manufacture them was staggering. And the logistical confidence required to base an entire invasion on artificial harbours suggested the Allies knew their supply system was so robust it could function even using improvised facilities. Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, which bore direct responsibility for defending Normandy, suffered a fatal heart attack on June 28. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but officers who had worked with him in the final weeks believed the stress of managing an unwinnable situation had killed him. Dollmann had been a competent professional, had understood what was required to defend the French coast, and had recognized within hours of the invasion that his forces lacked the resources to accomplish their mission. The 3 weeks between recognition and his death had apparently been spent fighting with increasing desperation, while understanding that desperation changed nothing about the material balance. His successor, Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser, took command of a situation that had deteriorated from hopeless to catastrophic. Allied forces now occupied a lodgment approximately 100 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. They had landed over 1 million troops and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. They were advancing inland methodically, using their material advantages to reduce German defensive positions through systematic application of artillery and air power. German casualties were mounting steadily, while replacements remained scarce. Equipment losses were irreplaceable because German industrial capacity was fully committed to supporting the Eastern Front and could not surge production to meet Western Front requirements. The strategic situation was approaching terminal velocity. Germany was fighting a 3-front war against enemies who collectively possessed 10 times German industrial capacity and were increasing their advantage through systematic destruction of German factories by strategic bombing. The Eastern Front was consuming forces faster than they could be generated. Italy was tying down divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. And now Normandy was creating a 4th front that would require resources Germany simply did not have. The mathematics were absolute and unforgiving. In late July, senior Wehrmacht officers, including Rommel, began discussing whether Germany should seek armistice terms before the situation deteriorated further. These discussions were dangerous, potentially treasonous, but they were based on military realism rather than defeatism. Germany had lost the war. That conclusion was now unavoidable to any officer who studied production figures, casualty rates, and operational trends. The only remaining question was whether Germany could negotiate surrender terms that preserved some degree of national sovereignty, or whether the Allies would demand unconditional surrender and total occupation. The July 20th attempt to assassinate Hitler and negotiate peace collapsed, destroying whatever slim possibility existed for rational strategic decision-making. Germany would continue fighting not because victory was possible, but because the regime could not conceive of any alternative to fighting. The war would continue until Germany was physically overrun, until every resource was exhausted, until the nation lay in ruins. The invasion Pluscat had watched from his bunker on June 6th would continue advancing, slowly but inexorably, until it reached Berlin. Pluscat himself spent the remainder of the war in Allied custody, first in temporary camps in Normandy, then in more permanent facilities in England, finally in American prison camps where he worked as a translator and participated in intelligence debriefings. He told his story to multiple interrogators, describing what he had seen on the morning of June 6th, explaining his assessment of the invasion's implications. The Americans listened with professional interest, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, treating him as a knowledgeable source rather than a defeated enemy. Years later, in the 1950s, after his repatriation to Germany, Pluscat was interviewed by historians researching the Normandy invasion. He described watching the fleet appear at dawn, counting ships until the numbers became meaningless, understanding within minutes that the invasion could not be stopped. The interviewer asked whether better German preparations could have changed the outcome. Pluscat's answer was unambiguous. No, the preparations were adequate for the invasion we expected. They were inadequate for the invasion that came. We expected an operation at the limit of Allied capability. They delivered an operation that was well within their capability. That difference was decisive. The interviewer pressed further. What could Germany have done differently? Pluscat considered the question carefully. We should have understood what American industrial capacity meant in practical terms. We knew they had large factories, but we thought in terms of German production scaled up. We did not understand that they had built an entirely different kind of industrial system, one where military production was just one output among many. They built 7,000 ships for one operation, while simultaneously building bombers to attack Germany and tanks to supply the Soviet Union, and trucks to supply all their forces everywhere. We could not have matched that even if we had started preparing in 1933 instead of fighting the war. The Normandy invasion represented the culmination of Allied industrial mobilization, the point where material superiority became so overwhelming that tactical and operational skill became largely irrelevant. German forces fought well throughout the Normandy campaign, achieving tactical successes, inflicting casualties, delaying Allied advances. But they were fighting an enemy who could absorb losses indefinitely, who could bring forward replacement equipment faster than it could be destroyed, who could sustain operations through sheer accumulated abundance. Every advantage the Wehrmacht had possessed in 1940 had been neutralized by 1944 through systematic industrial production. The 7,000 ships Pluscat had seen represented more than just naval capacity. They represented the economic output of two continents, the United States and the British Empire, fully mobilized for industrial warfare. They represented millions of workers in factories, thousands of engineers designing equipment, entire supply chains optimized for military production. They represented a system of warfare where victory went not to the most tactically skilled army, but to the nation that could produce the most ships, build the most tanks, manufacture the most aircraft, supply the most troops. Germany had lost that competition before the war started, and June 6, 1944 was simply the day when the consequences became visible. The Atlantic Wall had been a sophisticated defensive system, well designed, properly constructed, adequately manned. It had been defeated not because German engineers were incompetent, but because Allied industrial capacity made any static defense ultimately irrelevant. You could not defend against an enemy who could build invasion fleets faster than you could build coastal fortifications, who could manufacture landing craft faster than you could install obstacles, who could produce ammunition faster than you could construct bunkers. The defender's advantage existed only when both sides operated under comparable resource constraints. When one side achieved true material abundance, defensive advantage disappeared. The young soldiers who landed on Normandy beaches that morning, wading through surf under fire, crawling across sand while machine guns fired overhead, were not individually superior to the German soldiers defending those beaches. But they were backed by an industrial system that supplied them with everything they needed and replaced everything they lost. They could afford to take casualties because more troops were landing behind them. They could afford to lose equipment because more equipment was being brought ashore. They could afford to advance slowly because time favored the side with unlimited resources. The Americans and British fought competently but not brilliantly. They didn't need to fight brilliantly. They just needed to keep fighting, keep landing, keep advancing, and let mathematics do the rest. Pluscat lived until 1996, long enough to see Germany rebuilt, to see the Atlantic Wall fortifications converted to museums, to see his testimony about June 6th quoted in countless histories of the invasion. He never claimed that German forces could have won if they had fought better or prepared differently. He had been there. He had counted the ships. He had understood what 7,000 ships meant. And he had known, from that first moment at dawn, when the horizon disappeared beneath steel, that the invasion was unstoppable, not because of any failure of German arms, but because of the overwhelming success of Allied industry. The true weapon that won World War II was not any particular tank or aircraft or ship. It was the system of industrial mass production, perfected in American and British factories during the 1930s, proven in peacetime commercial production, converted to military purposes in the early 1940s, and finally deployed on June 6, 1944, with such devastating effectiveness that tactical resistance became strategically meaningless. Germany fought a 20th century war with 19th century assumptions about industrial capacity. The Allies fought with accurate understanding of what modern industry could accomplish when properly organized and fully mobilized. That difference was measured in thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies, and the distance between Normandy and Berlin. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.